There's a rhythm that forms in relationships with avoidant people. It's not one of closeness, consistency, or mutual vulnerability. It's a rhythm built on imbalance. One person reaches, the other retreats. One expresses, the other deflects. One leans in, the other pulls away. For a while, that rhythm feels normal. It might even feel like love if you've grown up learning that love means waiting, proving, or earning someone's affection. The avoidant partner doesn't mean to hurt you, but they are wired to fear dependence, both yours and theirs. They keep you at arm's length, not because they don't care, but because getting close feels unsafe. When things get emotional, they shut down. When you need reassurance, they grow cold. When conflict arises, they disappear instead of engaging. And when you try to reach out, to explain, to fix, to soothe, to hold the relationship together, they often respond with more distance, more silence, more walls. At first, you fill the silence. You do the emotional labor. You explain how you feel. You try to word things gently to not scare them off. You send the follow-up text. You initiate the talks. You keep making space for their needs while yours get smaller and smaller. It's a painful place to be, constantly questioning whether you're too much, whether your needs are valid, whether you're asking for something unreasonable by simply wanting emotional availability. And yet you keep trying. You keep speaking up, hoping they'll meet you halfway. Sometimes they do, just enough to keep you hoping. A breadcrumb of vulnerability here, a rare moment of affection there. But those moments are inconsistent. And the pattern always returns. They retreat, you try again. But there comes a moment when something inside you shifts. Not because you want to punish them or play games, but because you finally recognize that your words are falling on deaf ears. That your effort has become the background noise they expect, not something they value. You stop trying to explain your feelings. You stop writing long messages about how hurt you are. You stop initiating conversations about the distance you feel. It's not out of anger. It's not even intentional at first. It's exhaustion, emotional burnout. You've poured so much of yourself into trying to hold the relationship together that you have nothing left to give. So you retreat. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, gently, inward. And this is where the avoidant person begins to feel the shift. Because as much as they say they need space, they've grown used to you filling in all the blanks. They may not have wanted closeness, but they became dependent on your efforts to keep the connection alive. They relied on you to do the emotional heavy lifting. They didn't have to risk vulnerability because you were always the one to do it first. But when that changes, when you stop showing up in that way, they notice. Not because you yelled, not because you slammed a door, but because the energy is different. The silence they once found comforting now feels unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Suddenly, they're the one looking at the thread and wondering if it's unraveling. They reread your last few messages and realize there's no more reassurance there, no more reaching, no more emotional cushions. You're no longer softening your tone to make sure they don't shut down. You're no longer cushioning your needs to avoid seeming needy. You're no longer trying to keep the conversation alive when they go cold. And it hits them, subtly at first, then harder. You're not available in the way you used to be. Your silence isn't about playing hard to get. It's not a tactic. It's just real. It's what happens when someone who has been trying for so long finally steps back to breathe. And in that space, the avoidant feels something they didn't expect. Discomfort. Not because you're angry, but because you're no longer providing the emotional security they took for granted. The dynamic they depended on has shifted. They can no longer predict your responses. They no longer know if you'll be the one to fix things. There's no more emotional net waiting to catch them. And without that, they start to question what's really happening. They feel a sense of uncertainty. The very thing they've spent the relationship trying to avoid, but now it's not caused by closeness, it's caused by your absence. The avoidant has a narrative they tell themselves, a story that allows them to feel safe in their detachment. It says that they're not the problem, that needing space is strength, that emotional distance is maturity, that other people are always too needy, too dramatic, too much. This narrative protects them. It allows them to feel justified when they pull away or shut down. It comforts them when they leave texts unanswered or let days pass without communication. They don't believe they're causing harm. They believe believe they're simply being true to themselves. They think they're being independent, preserving their peace, and often they convince themselves that the other person, the one trying to connect, is overly sensitive, dependent, unstable, or clingy. That belief gives them an emotional out. It lets them stay disconnected without guilt. But everything changes the moment you stop reacting. Not out of coldness or manipulation, but from genuine detachment. When you no longer send long messages explaining how you feel. When you stop showing visible hurt after being met with indifference. When your energy is no longer emotionally charged around them. When you aren't angry, but also aren't apologizing for having feelings. You shift into a version of yourself that's calm, composed, and centered. Not for them, but for you. And they notice. Not immediately, but eventually. They sense the absence of intensity. They pick up on the lack of emotional urgency. They realize you're no longer seeking emotional validation from them, and in its place is something unfamiliar: neutrality, peace, strength. This unsettles them in a way they didn't expect. They were prepared for tears. They were prepared for frustration. They were prepared for you to try and explain yourself, to justify your emotions, to prove your worth. But they weren't prepared for quiet confidence. They weren't prepared for you to be okay. Because as much as they needed distance, they also needed the reassurance that you still cared, that you'd still try, that you hadn't really let go. They counted on your emotional reactions to affirm their place in your life, even if they pretended not to care. But now, those reactions are gone. When you stop being visibly hurt by their absence, when your tone softens not in desperation, but in clarity, when you start to show that you are emotionally unaffected by the behavior that once kept you up at night, the avoidant loses their grip on the story they've been telling themselves. They can no longer say you're unstable if you're grounded. They can't say you're clingy if you're distant. They can't say you're dramatic if you're calm. And without that narrative, they're forced to confront a reality they've worked hard to avoid. The reality that maybe you were never the problem. Maybe they pushed away someone who was actually strong, emotionally intelligent, and full of love. This realization is slow. It builds with every moment you don't respond how they expected. It builds when you stop over-explaining. When you stop seeking closure, when your presence becomes quieter but more powerful. And the hardest part for them is that they don't have access to that power anymore. They can't reach into your emotional world and feel needed. They can't lean on the comfort of knowing you'll chase. And suddenly, the absence they once created is no longer under their control. It's not them pulling away anymore, it's you letting go, but not loudly, not with resentment, with peace. That peace is what triggers their regret, because peace signals to them that they didn't just lose attention or affection, they lost emotional access. And for the avoidant, emotional access is what allowed them to feel secure while avoiding true intimacy. They got to have someone care deeply without having to fully show up. They got to feel chosen without having to choose back. But now that emotional safety net is gone, not because you took it away out of spite, but because you no longer need the approval they once held over you. That's the part they never saw coming. The idea that you could detach, not in a dramatic exit, but in a grounded, self-assured way. You show them, without saying a word, that their silence no longer has power, their distance no longer hurts you, their lack of emotional availability no longer keeps you stuck. You are no longer trying to decode mixed signals. You are no longer trying to win love from someone who resists closeness. You are simply choosing yourself, and in doing so, you disrupt the narrative they've used to feel comfortable in their avoidance. They begin to feel something unfamiliar. They feel the loss of emotional control. They feel the impact of their indifference. They see you not as needy, but as someone who was simply asking to be met halfway. There's something about seeing someone you once kept at a distance being embraced by someone else that shifts your entire perception. For the avoidant, who spent so much time rationalizing why you weren't the right fit or why closeness felt overwhelming, it's a moment that cuts through the fog. While they were pulling away, you were holding on. While they were convincing themselves they didn't need the connection, you were still showing up with love, with hope, with effort. But the avoidant often doesn't recognize the value of what they had while they're in it. Intimacy feels threatening. Vulnerability feels risky. They believe that by keeping distance, they're preserving their freedom, their control, their identity. What they don't realize is that in the process, they're creating a space so wide that eventually someone else steps into it. Someone who sees your worth without fear. Someone who gives you the consistency you are craving. Someone who doesn't flinch when emotions come up, who leans in instead of pulling away. And suddenly, from the outside looking in, the avoidant sees what they pushed away. They see you laughing again. They see you glowing. They see someone else holding the space they once left empty. It hits them not just in what they're seeing, but in what they're not feeling anymore. You're not reaching out. You're not trying to reopen the conversation. You're not giving them the energy they once took for granted. There's no more pursuit, just presence, your presence with someone who's able to meet you. This isn't about flaunting a new relationship. It's not about making them jealous. It's about the unavoidable contrast. The avoidant is faced with something they didn't expect, watching you receive the love you used to try and give them. In their mind, they always imagined that if they walked away or kept things vague, you would wait, that you'd be there, emotionally orbiting, still hoping they'd come around. They felt secure in the belief that their detachment didn't come with consequences, that their push and pull dynamic would continue indefinitely because you'd never truly let go. But now someone else is in the picture. Someone else sees your softness and doesn't mistake it for weakness. Someone else is attracted to your depth instead of avoiding it. Someone else is holding the very place the avoidant thought would always be open for them, and that's where regret begins to bloom. Not in anger, not in jealousy, in realization. They start to question what they were afraid of. They start to remember the warmth of your attention, the way you listened, the way you made them feel understood even when they struggled to understand themselves. They remember the emotional safety you created, and now they have to watch as that safety is given to someone who didn't waste time fearing it. The avoidant often needs a mirror, and nothing reflects their avoidance more clearly than seeing you be loved by someone else. It confronts them with the truth that love isn't the problem. Intimacy isn't the threat. It's what they associated it with. It's what they feared it would cost them. But now, as they watch you love and be loved, they see that the thing they resisted was the very thing they needed. They see how freely you're showing up for someone else, how easily your affection flows when it's received instead of rejected. They feel a discomfort they can't immediately explain. It's not just that someone else is with you, it's that you look happier, you look lighter. You're not carrying the emotional tension that existed with them. There's no confusion on your face, no worry in your eyes. The anxiety that came with trying to navigate an avoidant dynamic has been replaced by ease, and that ease becomes a powerful teacher. Because now, the avoidant doesn't just remember the connection, they see it for what it could have been. They see what they missed, not in theory, but in practice. Someone else is experiencing what they were too afraid to hold, and in that experience, they're forced to reckon with the consequences of their fear. The exact closeness they once rejected is now unfolding in front of them, and it's too late to claim it. They aren't watching a fantasy, they're watching reality. The reality of you being seen, of you being cherished, of you being chosen by someone who didn't need time to decide if you were enough. The avoidant sees it all, the way you lean into this new connection, the way you no longer hide parts of yourself to feel accepted, the way you stand tall in your softness. And they realize they pushed away something they now wish they could reach for. Regret doesn't always arrive in one loud, dramatic moment. Sometimes it sneaks in slowly, quietly. It lingers in the spaces where a connection used to live, in the silence that follows a missed call or an unanswered message that never gets sent. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, regret often doesn't register immediately after they pull away. In fact, in the beginning, there's often a sense of relief, a return to what feels like safety, a breathing room that they believe they desperately needed. They might even convince themselves that the distance was a good decision, that relationships are too complicated, too demanding, too intense, and in their mind, they rationalize it. They build a story that lets them feel like walking away was healthy, that avoiding emotional intimacy is strength, that detachment is wisdom. But that story begins to crumble the moment you start healing without them. Because the one thing that triggers the deepest regret in the avoidant is not your tears. It's not your confrontation. It's not your longing. It's your peace, your indifference, your silence, your happiness that doesn't include them. The avoidant expects resistance. They expect pleas for clarity. They expect you to stay emotionally entangled in the disconnection. Because that's what always happens. That's what validates their narrative. That's what helps them stay emotionally detached without guilt. As long as you're still emotionally activated, they still have some form of control. But when that cord is cut, when you are no longer feeding the connection with your energy, they are left with something they don't know how to process: emptiness. And in that emptiness, they begin to remember the things they once dismissed. The way your voice softened when they were overwhelmed. The way your patience wrapped around their walls instead of trying to tear them down. The way you offered love, not as a demand, but as an invitation. They remember your laughter, your encouragement, your presence, all the things they were too distracted or too afraid to fully appreciate in the moment. And the tragedy for them is that those moments weren't grand. They weren't cinematic. They were subtle, quiet, real, the little things that add up to something extraordinary when they're gone. The avoidant doesn't regret leaving during the argument. They regret what they lost when there was no more argument to come back to. When the dust settles and you're no longer waiting on the other side, they begin to see what they didn't allow themselves to feel before. They realize how safe you actually were, how rare your emotional clarity was, how you didn't ask for perfection, only honesty, how you didn't try to change them, only understand them. And that's where the regret begins to settle in, not as a wave, but as a slow burn, a growing awareness that they had something stable, something grounded, something nourishing, and they walked away from it. They begin to understand that the problem wasn't love. It was how they showed up in the presence of it. They see that you didn't pressure them for more than they could give. You simply hoped they'd show up with what they had. But instead of leaning in, they leaned out. Instead of choosing depth, they chose comfort. And that comfort came at the cost of connection. When they remember you now, it's not through the lens of your flaws or the difficulties. They remember how you made them feel when they were with you. How even in their avoidance, even in their inconsistency, you kept showing up with clarity, and now they're left with a silence they once thought they wanted, only to find it deafening. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer sending the messages they've come to expect. You've redirected that energy inward into rebuilding your peace, your power, your worth. And that's what they never anticipated, that you wouldn't just disappear, you would evolve. And your evolution is the loudest silence they've ever heard. It says everything they tried not to hear while you were still speaking. It reveals that you were never asking for too much. You were offering more than they knew how to hold. And now, as they sit in the stillness they once craved, they're met with the reality that someone else could have been their home, but they were too afraid to walk through the door.